We're back with part 3 of this week's reading of the Messianic Jewish Family Bible, Tree of Life version, TLV, and we had just completed chapter 26 before I took the break to come back with this part. So we are going to begin chapter 27. David settles in Ziklag. Then David said in his heart, "One day I'll be swept away by the hand of Saul. There's nothing better for me than to escape immediately to the land of the Philistines. Then Saul will be then Saul will give up searching for me in all the territories of Israel, so I'll escape from his hand." So David rose and crossed over, he and the 600 men that were with him, to Achish, son of Maok, king of Gath. David stayed with Achish at Gath, he and his men, every man with his household, and David with his 2 wives, Ahinoam of Jezreel and Abigail of Carmel, Nabal's widow. So when Saul was told that David had fled to Gath, he no longer searched for him. Then David said to Achish, "If now I have found favor in your eyes, let me be given a place in one of the country towns, so I may live there. Why should your servant stay in the royal city with you?" So Achish granted him Ziklag that day. Thus Ziklag came to belong to the kings of Judah to this day. The number of days that David stayed in the country of the Philistines was a year and 4 months. Now David and his men went up and raided the Jezreelites, the Gizrites, and the Amalekites, for those were inhabitants of the region from ancient times, as you go all the way from Shur and as far as the land of Egypt. David attacked the region and was leaving not a man or woman alive, and took away sheep, oxen, donkeys, camels, and clothing. When he returned and came to Achish, Achish would say, "Where have you raided today?" So David would reply, "Against the Negev of Judah, against the Negev of Jeram, Jerahmeelites, and against the Negev of Kenites." David left no man or woman alive to bring to Gath, thinking, "Unless they should tell us, saying, so did David." So was his practice all the time he stayed in the country of the Philistines. Then Achish trusted David, saying, "He has certainly made himself abhorrent to his people Israel, therefore he will be my vassal forever." So this was actually David's solution at the moment to get Saul off his back, was to go to live with the Philistines. And as it turned out, he was staying with the king of Gath, and remember Goliath was of Gath, the giant. But the king of Gath actually did give him Ziklag, the town of Ziklag, and that actually belonged to Judah then. So David stayed there for a year and 4 months, and he went to battle actually with different the different people, the Jezreelites, the Gizrites, the Amalekites, and so he actually gained trust in the king of Gath. So he stayed in the country of the Philistines for that time period. Then we're going to go to chapter 28, a really important chapter. Saul consults a medium, which is the witch of Endor, actually, which is something that we're not to do. At that time, the Philistines gathered their armed forces to fight against Israel. Achish said to David, "You surely know that you and your men must march out with me in the army." David said to Achish, "Well, then you know what your servant will do." "Well, then I appoint you my bodyguard for life," Achish said to David. Now Samuel had died, and all Israel had lamented him and buried him in Ramah, his hometown. Saul had removed from the land those who were mediums and spiritists. So the Philistines mustered and came and camped in Shunem, and Saul gathered all Israel together, and they camped at Gilboa. Now, when Saul saw the camp of the Philistines, he was afraid, and his heart trembled greatly. When Saul inquired of Adonai, Adonai did not answer, neither by dreams nor by Urim or prophets. Then Saul said to his courtiers, "Find me a woman who is a medium, so I may go to her and inquire through her." So his courtiers said to him, "Behold, there is a woman that is a medium at Endor. So once again, even up to his one of his last moves, he went against what God would have wanted and took matters into his own hands. He got impatient, and um, well, God was not going to answer him at this point anyway. So Paul, so Saul disguised himself, put on other clothes, and went with two other men, and they reached the woman by night. Then he said, "Please conjure up for me a ghost. Bring up for me the one I will name to you." "Look, you know what Saul has done," she said, "how he has cut off the mediums and spiritists from the land. So why then are you setting a trap for my life to get me killed?" Saul vowed to her by Adonai, saying, "As Adonai lives, no punishment will come on you for this thing." "Whom will I bring up for you?" the woman asked. "Bring me up Samuel," he said. But when the woman saw Samuel, she cried out with a loud shriek. Then the woman spoke to Saul, saying, "Why have you deceived me? You are Saul." "Don't be afraid," the king said to her. "What do you see?" The woman said to Saul, "I see a godlike being coming up from the earth." "What does he look like?" he asked her. "An old man is coming up, and he is wrapped with a robe," she said. Then Saul knew that it was Samuel, so he bowed down and prostrated himself with his face to the ground. Samuel said to Saul, "Why have you disturbed me by bringing me up?" "I'm in great distress," Saul answered. "The Philistines are waging war against me, and God has turned away from me. He doesn't answer me anymore, whether by prophets or by dreams. So I called you up to tell me what I should do." Samuel said, "So why ask me, since Adonai has turned away from you and become your adversary? Now Adonai has done for himself just as he foretold through me. Adonai has torn the kingship out of your hand and has given it to another fellow, to David. Since you did not obey the voice of Adonai and did not execute his fierce wrath on Amalek, so Adonai has done this to you today. Moreover, Adonai will also give the Israelites who are with you into the hands of the Philistines. Tomorrow you and your sons will be with me. Yes, Adonai will give the army of Israel into the hand of the Philistines." Then Saul immediately fell full length upon the ground and became so terrified because of the words of Samuel that there was absolutely no strength in him, for he had eaten nothing all day and night. Then the woman came to Saul and saw that he was so agitated, so she told him, "Behold, your maidservant obeyed you. I put my life in your hand by listening to your words, which you spoke to me. Please, you too listen to the voice of your maidservant, and let me set a morsel of bread before you, so you can eat and have strength to go on your way." But he refused and said, "I won't eat." But when his courtiers and the woman urged him, he listened to them. So he got up from the ground and sat on the bed. The woman had a fatted calf in the house, so she hurried and butchered it, and took flour and kneaded it, and baked unleavened bread from it. So she brought it before Saul and the courtiers, and they ate. Then they arose and went away that night. So the Philistines were gathered to fight um, the army of Israel, and Saul was not hearing from God at all. So he decided to go to the witch of Endor, who was a medium, and bring up Samuel. And that's like, having a seance, getting a psychic reading, the whole nine yards all in one, which is something that we're not to do. We're not to seek witches, wizards, psychics, mediums, spiritists, none of those things, because they're not generally they're dealing with familiar spirits. They're not dealing with the Holy Spirit. So you're actually opening up doors to demonic presence as well. So God does not want us um, associating with that kind of practice. So this is what happened in chapter 28. And when Samuel addressed him, he said, "Why would you come to me when, the Lord has actually turned away from you? What am I going to do? In fact, you and your sons are going to be with me." And he actually told him that basically, tomorrow, you and your sons will be with me, meaning they were going to be dead. Um, Chapter 29, David sent back from battle. Now the Philistines mustered all their armies at Aphek, while the Israelites were camping by the spring in Jezreel. As the Philistine lords were proceeding ahead of their hundreds and thousands, David and his men were bringing up the rear with Achish. Then the Philistine commanders said, "What are these Hebrews doing here?" Achish said to the Philistine commanders, "No, that's David, servant of Israel's king Saul. He's been with me today for over a year, and I've not found any fault in him since the day he defected to me until now." But the Philistine commanders got angry with him, and the Philistine commanders said to him, "Make this man go back to his place you assigned him. He must not go down with us to battle, or in the battle he might become our adversary." So they were concerned that David would, then turn on them. 4. How would this fellow appease his Lord? Wouldn't it be with the heads of our men? Isn't this one David about whom they were singing in dances, saying, "Saul has slain thousands, and David his 10,000s?" So Achish called David and said to him, "As Adonai lives, you have been upright, and your going out and your coming in with me in the army are pleasing in my eyes. For I never found fault with you since the day of your coming to me up to this day. However, the other lords do not approve of you. So now turn around and go back in peace, and you won't be doing anything to displease the Philistine lords." "But what have I done?" David said to Achish. "What have you found in your servant from the day I have been before you to this day that I shouldn't go and fight against the enemies of my lord the king?" "I know," Achish answered, saying to David, "you are as pleasing in my eyes as an angel of God. Nevertheless, the Philistine commanders have said, 'He must not go up with us to the battle.' So now rise up early in the morning, you and the servants of your lord that came with you, and as soon you rise early in the morning, once there is a light, leave." So David rose up early, he and his men, leaving in the morning to return to the land of the Philistines. Meanwhile, the Philistines went up to Jezreel. So Achish trusted David, but the other Philistine lords did not. But it's a good thing that David and his men went back, as we're going to see in chapter 30. Raid on Amalek. Now it came to pass when David and his men returned to Ziklag on the third day that the Amalekites had made a raid on the Negev and on Ziklag, and attacked Ziklag and burned it with fire, taking the women in it, captive young and old, without killing anyone, but carried them off as they went their way. So when David and his men came to the town, behold, it was burned with fire, and their wives, their sons, and their daughters had been taken captives. Then David and the troops with him lifted up their voice and wept until they there were no, there was no more strength in them to weep. Even David's two wives were taken captive, Ahinoam of Jezreel and Abigail of Carmel, Nabal's widow. So David was in a serious bind, for the troops were calling for his stoning. For all the troops were bitter of soul, every man for his sons and his daughters. But David strengthened himself in Adonai, his God. So even in a bad situation, David turned to God to get strength. Then David said to Abiathar the Kohen, son of Ahimelech, "Please bring me the ephod." So Abiathar brought the ephod to David. David inquired of Adonai, saying, "Should I pursue after this raiding band? Should I overtake them?" He answered, "Pursue, for you will surely overtake, and you will surely rescue." So David went, he and the 600 men with him, and came to the Wadi Besor, where those left behind remained, for 200 men stayed behind, because they were too exhausted to cross the Wadi Besor. Yet David pursued, he and the other 400 men. Then they found an Egyptian in the open field, and brought him to David, gave him bread to eat and water to drink, and they also gave him a piece of fig cake and 2 cakes of raisins. When he had eaten, his spirit came back to him, for he had eaten no bread and drunk no water for 3 days and 3 nights. Then David asked him, "To whom do you belong? Where are you from?" "I am a young Egyptian, the slave of an Amalekite," he said. "My master abandoned me 3 days ago because I fell sick. We made a raid in the Negev of the of the Cherethites, and on Judah and on the Negev of Caleb also we burned Ziklag with fire. Then David asked him, Will you lead me to this raiding band? Swear to me by God that you won't kill me or deliver me into my master's hands, he said, and I will lead you to this marauding band. So he led him down, and behold, they were scattered over all the area, eating, drinking, and feasting because of all the great spoil that they had taken from the land of the Philistines and from the hand of Judah. David attacked them from the twilight until the evening of the next day. None of them escaped except 400 men who rode on camels and fled. So David recovered all that the Amalekites had taken and rescued his 2 wives. There was nothing of theirs missing, whether young or old, sons or daughters, spoil or anything else that had been carried off. David recovered everything. David took all the flocks and the herd that they had driven ahead of the other cattle, so they said, This is David's spoil. When David reached the 200 men who had been too exhausted to follow and were left at the Wadi Besor, they came out to meet David and to meet the men with him. So David approached these people and greeted them. But all the wicked men and worthless fellows among those who accompanied David said, Because they did not accompany us, we shouldn't give them any of the spoil that we recovered, except every man may take his wife and his children and leave. You must not do so, my brothers, with what Adonai has given us, David said. It is he who has protected us and gave into our hands the raiding band that attacked us. Who would listen to you in this matter? The share of him who went down to the battle is to be the same as that of him who remained by the baggage. They will share alike. So it has been from that day forward. He made it a statute and an ordinance for Israel to this day. When David arrived at Ziklag, he sent some of the spoil to the elders of Judah to his friends, saying, Look, a blessing for you from the spoil of the enemies of Adonai to those in Beth El, Ramoth Negev, Jeter, Eror, Sifmoth, Eshtemoa, Rakal, to those in the towns of Jerahmeelites, to those in the towns of the Kenites, Hormah, Borishan, Athak, Hebron, and to all the places where David and his men had roamed. I'm sorry, Hebron. Oh, I'm not sure. This is saying 35 minutes, and I don't think I spoke for 35 minutes. So I'm going to pause it here and come back with part 4, just to be safe.